Welcome to NTD Newsroom. I'm Don Ma. President Trump signing a rare earths deal with Australian Prime Minister Albanese, this in an effort to curb dependence on China. A top White House advisor expects the government shutdown to end this week, what he says President Trump will do if that fails to happen. In Chicago, a federal judge is questioning ICE and Border Patrol officials on the use of force and body camera compliance, while Illinois prepares a response to the Trump administration's request to deploy the National Guard. NTD's Chris Bob is downtown with the latest. President Trump will increase tariffs and cut subsidies to Colombia over drug trafficking. We discussed this with the Latin America correspondent for the Epoch Times. A fragile ceasefire is holding after the deaths of 2 Israeli soldiers and a wave of airstrikes on Gaza. The U.S. State Department warns Hamas to stop any planned attacks. 8 priceless jewels were stolen from the Louvre Museum in Paris. While the museum was open, police are now racing against time to find the thieves.
This is NTD Newsroom, live from our global headquarters in New York City.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. President Trump and Australian Prime Minister Albanese signing a joint minerals deal in efforts to curb dependence on China. And the president floating other threats on China ahead of his meeting with CCP leader Xi Jinping in South Korea. We now go live to NTD's Mari Otsu at the White House. Good afternoon, Mari. What can you tell us about Prime Minister Albanese's visit?
Don, good afternoon. As China is now imposing tougher export controls on its own critical minerals, today President Trump and Australian Prime Minister Albanese are signing a joint rare earths deal in an effort to curb dependence on China. The deal involves the mining, processing, and exporting of these rare earths from Australia to the U.S. Take a look.
We've had a very good relationship. We've been working on that for quite a while. In about a year from now, we'll have so much critical mineral and rare earths that you won't know what to do with them. They'll be worth about $2.
And White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett this morning is saying that Australia will be really helpful in the effort to make the global economy less vulnerable to the, quote, rare earth extortion that we're seeing from the Chinese. President Trump and Albanese are also talking submarines and military equipment today, with President Trump saying that the AUKUS pact, a Biden-era security agreement between the U.S., the UK, and Australia, is, quote, moving along very rapidly. President Trump also restates that additional 100% tariff threat on China if they cannot make a deal by November 1st, and floats export restrictions on aircrafts. Take a look.
Said, if we don't make a deal, I'm putting on an additional 100% on November 1st. I think we'll make a deal. They threatened us with rare earths, and I threatened them with tariffs, but I could also threaten them with many other things, like airplanes. You know about airplanes, because they can't get parts for their airplanes. We build their airplanes.
Trump is projecting optimism about getting a trade deal out of his expected meeting with CCP leader Xi Jinping on the sidelines of APEC in South Korea in about 2 weeks. But he also says that he demands China to buy American soybeans. And on Sunday, he demanded that China curb the export of fentanyl to the United States. Don, back to you.
All right, Mari, thank you. Australia is demanding answers from Beijing. A Chinese fighter jet released flares dangerously close to a Royal Australian Air Force plane over the South China Sea. Canberra says the flares came within striking distance of the aircraft, calling the maneuver unsafe and unprofessional. Australia's defense minister said the country formally raised the incident with China through both embassies, warning it posed a serious risk to the aircraft and crew. China's military accused Australia of intruding into airspace near the Parcella Islands, territory Beijing claims, and said it deployed forces to monitor and expel the plane. No injuries were reported. This marks the third dangerous encounter in less than a year. Australia says it will continue lawful patrols in international airspace and expects China to operate safely under international law. The U.S. and China will hold a new round of trade talks this weekend in Malaysia to prevent another tariff clash. President Trump called his proposed additional tariffs on Chinese goods unsustainable, speaking on Fox News.
I raised our tariffs to 100% on top of what they're already paying, which is far worse, far worse. We'll see what happens with China. They're always looking for an edge. You know, they ripped off our country for years. We're going to meet in a couple of weeks. We're going to meet in South Korea.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says he will meet in Malaysia with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng to prevent a new round of tariffs. The two officials discussed trade in a video call Friday, agreeing to continue talks before the current tariff truce expires on November 10th. The meeting comes amid disputes over China's export restrictions on rare earth minerals. This comes just days after a major shakeup in China's military. Last Friday, Beijing ousted its #2 general and the army's top political officer, along with 7 other high-ranking generals. The purge raises questions about whether this could impact China's ability to take Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party sees Taiwan as part of China despite never having ruled it. Beijing has vowed to take it under control by force if necessary. The recent developments have sparked speculation that Xi Jinping may be losing power. President Donald Trump and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese met today at the White House. Joining us to discuss is Grant Newsroom, retired U.S. Marine Colonel, former U.S. diplomat, and senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Colonel, always good to see you. Can you talk to us about how significant this first meeting is between the two leaders?
Well, it's a good meeting. I think particularly having signed the agreement on rare earth exports from Australia. Australia is swimming in rare earths, and they could probably provide all of America's requirements. The state of Montana probably could as well. But the fact that Australia has stepped up and says it's ready to develop its industry here and to link up with the United States and make Australia a main, if not the main source of rare earths is a big deal. The two leaders, and I think Albanese and Trump may not like each other very much, but that's beside the point. That this is a significant thing, particularly given the importance of rare earths.
Do you think this meeting has improved the two nations' ties, its relationship?
Well, I don't know. In one sense, I suppose it's always good to sort of get together and have a cordial meeting. But there's something about Australia that if you live there, if you pay attention, and you say, for example, read the Australian press for a week, they despise Donald Trump. And there's also a latent sense of, not so latent actually, sense of anti-Americanism in Australia's political and ruling class. Hard to imagine, particularly for people of my generation, where we've always thought the Australians and the Americans love each other. And the Australians, make no mistake, are fine people and have a very good military, even if it doesn't quite have a strategy. But there's something going on here where the relationship is not what it was. It's still basically okay, but there is more friction than one would imagine, particularly coming from the Australian side.
Okay, Colonel, let me put it this way. If, let's say, China invades Taiwan, can the U.S. depend on Australia for help?
Maybe. And I would say it's better than 50% chance, but that's not huge. Australia also, one has to ask, well, which of Australia's 11 warships are they going to send up to help? The Australian military is very professional, but it doesn't have the hardware really that it needs. Their air force is good, of course, but would the Australian government, a Labour government in particular, would they go in on a Taiwan fight? I don't know. They say they will, or suggest they will, but I'm not sure. There's a sort of a softness towards the People's Republic of China in the Australian administration, in the Labour Party, that one cannot overlook. And they have shown a willingness to sort of put national interest or national security second to the opportunity to sell lobster and wine to China. So it's not sure, it's not clear. I'd say it's better than 50% chance, but it's not what it once was. And I say the Australia of 30 years ago is not the Australia of today.
Okay, so if China is looking at this, what might they be thinking? How are they reacting? What message does this meeting send to Beijing?
Well, it certainly is better than an acrimonious meeting, like as Mr. Trump has had, say, with Ramaphosa of South Africa. and also Zelensky once or twice. But so the Australians see that the Americans and the Australians are getting along, they are cooperating, and the AUKUS agreement as well, where the Americans are going to provide submarines and submarine technology to Australia. That's a big deal. So China looks at this and says, well, how do we have to split this relationship? And economic pressure on Australia is one way that they are going to go about it. And that's they also have a political warfare effort, very active against Australia, and they are using the Chinese diaspora in Australia to exert influence on this, and also appealing to that fundamental resentment that you find in parts of Australian society against the United States. So China knows it has its work cut out for it when it comes to Australia, but it also sees that it has some opportunities.
Okay, so you said earlier that the Australia now is not the Australia 30 years ago. Can you talk about that shift a little bit? What has changed? How is Australia balancing its ties between the US and China?
Well, partly, and I'm sort of half joking, is that a lot of people have the image of Australia as a bunch of Paul Hogans, or also as a bunch of the people who stopped the Japanese in New Guinea on the Kokoda Track in 1942, and the first ones to do it. And it's just it's a change in sort of national character. It's hard to explain. Partly, a certain type of people has died off. And what you do have is one that is, in some respects, anti-military, and also is all in on the green, sort of the green movement, despite Australia having all the energy resources it needs. And it simply is not as committed to its own defense, it seems. And it has gotten itself dependent on the People's Republic of China. Australia doesn't make very much anymore. And when it comes to energy, it probably has about 3 or 4 weeks in the event those supplies were cut off. So it hasn't taken national security as seriously as it used to. But I will stress the Australian Defence Forces are very, very professional. The big problem with them is there's not 10 times as many of them. But in terms of the country, it's almost they haven't decided if they're exactly what they are pro. Are they pro-West, or are they trying to split the difference? And for many years, in recent times, the Australians have said, well, we want to rely on China for our economy. We want to rely on the Americans for security. Well, you can only do that for so long. At some point, you're going to have to choose, and that's a balancing act that really can't continue. And when you do look, as I said, at the nature of the Australian Labor Party and even some of the Liberals, the Conservatives, that there is a sort of a distancing, I think, from the United States and from sort of the West, as you might call it, and a cozying up to the PRC. Of course, business interests in Australia, just like in the United States, who do their best to ensure that China's interests are well represented.
Okay, so you're saying that this balancing act can't continue. How crucial is Australia to U.S. efforts to counter China? Can the U.S. do without Australia or other nations in the area like New Zealand as well?
Well, we could probably do without New Zealand, but Australia is very important. I would say it's not as important as Japan when it comes to regional defense, but it's a close second. When it comes to that. Geographically, Australia is very important if you're going to not just conduct military operations, but you want all the help you can get. And the political benefit of having Australia aligned with us or on side, and having the Australian military available to pitch in where they can. And they have always been willing to do that to date. That is important. And there's a political, psychological aspect to having Australia as a solid ally, not just of the United States, but of Japan and the other free nations in the region. So it's an important piece of the puzzle. Is it indispensable? It's hard to say. Well, maybe not, but you certainly don't want to have Australia drift away into some sort of inadvertent neutrality.
All right, so Colonel, I want to pull on a thread that you mentioned earlier on rare earths. Is it possible for Australia and the U.S. to cooperate in such a way to reduce complete dependency, eliminate complete dependency on China on critical minerals?
I think it probably is. Not just Australia. As I said, the United States has plenty of them in America. But Australia is blessed with an overabundance of these things. And if they're serious about it, they make the effort. That the Chinese may find that, well, they're not quite as important as they used to be. And this could happen quicker than people think if the will is there. But do expect the PRC, the Chinese, to apply a lot of pressure on Australia to try to sabotage and sort of coerce the Australians into not moving forward as fast as they could or as much as they could with this rare earth proposal that Albanese just signed today with President Trump.
Okay, Colonel, just one last question. Can you speak in detail what has been the impact, really, in the real world of China's dominance on rare earths?
Well, it is such that the Americans and the Trump administration have not been able to do anything near what they would like to do in applying economic pressure and other pressure on the PRC. By China playing this card, it put the administration in a position where they had major companies, American companies, coming to the White House and saying, look, if we don't have ready access to these things, we're going to have to shut down some of our factories within a matter of weeks. And that's how big a chokehold the Chinese have got. They've set about this decades ago, and they have gone about really getting a vertical lock on the entire rare earth industry to the point where the figure is something like 70% of all rare earths come from China, and 90% of the processing is done in China. And that is a stranglehold. But sometimes when you have that stranglehold, it doesn't quite have the effect you think. It's not as if the Americans and the West are going to roll over. What you could find is it simply has spurred them on to doing things like the Americans and the Australians have agreed to do and develop alternative sources, alternative rare earth industries, in effect, processing systems. And China may find itself with a lot of rare earths, but not being the only game in town. And that is something that we just might see.
Well, okay, Colonel, great insight as always. Pleasure speaking with you.
Well, thanks very much.
In Chicago, a federal judge is questioning ICE and Border Patrol officials on the use of force in body camera compliance, while Illinois prepares a response to the Trump administration's request to deploy the National Guard. Don't go away. Right now, downtown Chicago, a federal judge is pressing immigration and customs enforcement and Border Patrol officials on the recent use of force and tear gas during immigration operations, as well as compliance with her order requiring all federal agents under Operation Midway Blitz to wear and activate their body cameras. NTD's Chris Bob is downtown to update us. Chris, can you give us a sense of what led to this point and why federal agents are back in court today?
Good afternoon, Don. Yes, so I'm outside the Dirksen U.S. Courthouse where currently there's a hearing going on with a couple DHS officials. We saw earlier Kyle Havrick go in from Customs and Border Patrol, as well as Sean Byers, who's with ICE. He's the deputy director. This all relates to Operation Midway Blitz, which is ongoing in Chicago. We learned last week from a DHS statement that it has led to over 1,500 arrests so far in Illinois. The issue is there have been incidents where tear gas have been deployed. The specific hearing is focusing on a previous order, which was issued by the U.S. District Court Judge Sarah Ellis, blocking these law enforcement officials from using tear gas on journalists, on protesters who don't pose a threat. But last Tuesday, there was an incident where, in the process of apprehending two individuals in a car that reports say rammed into another vehicle, a crowd gathered and was disrupting law enforcement, so tear gas was utilized. This has happened in many other cities that we've been covering with regard to the ICE deployments. You see a large crowd gather and honk their horns or stand in front of ICE agents who are trying to apprehend people who have entered the country illegally. Right now, we're trying to figure out what the result will be. There's another issue here at play, which is the utilization of body cameras on these ICE agents. It was previously ordered by the same judge that all ICE agents should wear body cameras, and while they're fulfilling their duties, they should have them on. I want to read to you the statement that she made when it was previously discovered that some agents were not using body cameras. This was not a suggestion. It wasn't a hint. It wasn't a topic of discussion or conversation. It was an order. So I will enter it today, and then I will expect it to be followed. It will be followed. We heard from the second in command of CBP that there are 232 agents in the area. A couple dozen will be leaving tomorrow, but he confirmed that they all have working cameras and they will be utilizing them.
So, Chris, in addition to today's hearing on ICE and Border Patrol, the Trump administration recently asked the Supreme Court to allow the immediate deployment of National Guard troops in Illinois. How does that intersect with today's hearing on ICE and Border Patrol actions?
We're waiting for some updates today from Illinois. If you remember, on October 4th, President Trump issued an order to federalize or take control of the National Guard in Illinois, 300 members, as well as the deployment of 200 National Guardsmen from Texas and 16 troops from California. That was blocked last week when I was flying in. And we know that U.S. District Judge April Perry issued a restraining order on October 9th forbidding the administration from deploying the National Guard. The statement there was no credible evidence that there is a danger of rebellion in the state of Illinois. So today we're waiting for the state of Illinois. They have until 4 p.m. Local time, or 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, to issue a response to an ask from the federal government to the U.S. Supreme Court to weigh in on April Perry's order blocking the deployment. So right now, the Supreme Court was asked by the federal government to weigh in an emergency fashion, and Illinois should be responding within the next couple of hours. Back to you, Don.
Okay, Chris, thank you for the report. Colombia's foreign ministry said today the country has recalled its ambassador from the United States. On Sunday, Trump accused Colombian President Gustavo Petro of being involved in the drug trafficking, alleging he has knowledge of drug fields in Colombia. Trump also immediately halted all subsidy payments to Colombia.
They are a drug manufacturing machine, Colombia, and we're not going to be part of it. So we're going to drop all money that we're giving to them. It has nothing to do with them stopping drug production. And you look at the fields are loaded up with drugs, and they refine the drugs, and they make tremendous amounts of cocaine, and they send it all over the world, and they destroy families. No, Colombia is out of control, and now they have the worst president they've ever had. He's a lunatic who's got a lot of problems, mental problems.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth also said U.S. forces carried out an airstrike on a vessel linked to a Colombian terror group. He said the group was carrying large amounts of narcotics along a known drug route. Colombia's President Petro defended his administration's efforts to combat drug trafficking in Colombia, the world's leading cocaine producer. He called himself Colombia's strongest opponent to narcotics. President Trump will increase tariffs and cut subsidies to Colombia over drug trafficking. Joining us to discuss is Marcos Shadguez, editor-in-chief for the Epoch Times Brazil and Latin America correspondent for the Epoch Times USA. So good to see you today. Trump accused President Petro of facilitating drug production. What are your initial thoughts on this, the overall situation here?
Well, hey, Don. So thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. Now, my initial thoughts are twofold. One, this is part of a campaign pledge really by President Trump to try to focus on national security and try to lessen the flow of drugs into the United States. On the other hand, we have Marco Rubio being the first Latino Secretary of State, and that's not by chance. The US has been very aware of trying to secure its influence on its near abroad, so we're talking Latin America mostly. And that really is another step in the sense of strong arming lots of mainly left-leaning Latino leaders, Latin American leaders, into a position that's less adversarial towards the US. So my initial thoughts are twofold: campaign pledge on national security, and then also, of course, asserting US influence in its near abroad in the Latin America region.
But I can't help but wonder whether this is going to impact relations between the two nations. Can you speak to that?
I mean, the relationship is not excellent between President Trump and President Petro. Let's not forget that on the early days of the second Trump administration, Petro was refusing deportation flights of Latino immigrants in the US, illegal immigrants who were being deported, and he was not happy with the way that was happening. So Trump basically started talking about tariffs and even posted a picture of himself, Trump, on Truth Social dressed as a gangster. And talking specifically about Petro. So the relationship is not great, but there's a broader picture here where Colombia, of course, is probably the most traditional US ally in the region. So in the broader context of the long-term relationship between both countries, there is some leeway, some maneuvering room for us to see how this plays out. But in the short term, the relationship was already not great, and this is yet another escalation. But I wouldn't say it's exactly a breakthrough. It's another chapter of a broader trend we're seeing during the second Trump administration.
So do you think Colombia will respond in some form? How will they respond?
I mean, they have already recalled their U.S. ambassador. That's a response. I'm not sure exactly what other moves Petro has in his hand, and he definitely has to be careful not to overplay his hand in international relations. Let's not forget that Colombia has elections coming up. Petro can't run for a second term. The constitutional rules in Colombia are that presidents only get to run for one term, but he will definitely try to get somebody else to follow up on his footsteps. He is the first leftist president in Colombia's history, or at least recent history, and it's very challenging for him right now. So he has a very delicate, way to walk towards this, because at the same time he will want to manage the international situation and try to avoid further escalation of an international crisis. Because the elections are coming up after all. But on the other hand, while this is also a diplomatic issue, it is true that Colombia is the world's leading cocaine producer. It is also true, according to the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, that Colombia has skyrocketed production and it's breaking record after record. The production has been rising for the last 13 years. So what Colombia could do in response? I mean, recalling the ambassador is a symbolic move, but they're in a position right now where it's very hard for them to have the cards, and even with the cards that they have to be very careful not to overplay their hand, because, as I said, elections are coming up, and Petro has a big task ahead if he wants to have somebody else on the left come after him in Colombia's presidency.
So, following up on that, how do you think what President Trump said, including the idea of tariffs, withdrawing subsidies, how could that influence Colombia's internal politics?
I mean, I think it will definitely have an influence. It's hard to tell right now because some of the leaders that Trump has antagonized, if we're talking in an electoral sense, some could say it has backfired. I mean, if you look at Pierre Poilievre and Justin Trudeau in Canada, what happened was that Mark Carney, the leftist candidate, eventually, also because of Canadian sentiment towards Trump, ended up having a boom in popularity and turned around the situation where liberals were set to lose the election in Canada. We have also seen in my native Brazil, Lula gaining popularity during a standoff with Trump. So it's hard to tell how it's going to play out because that's, of course, not a hard set rule, but we have seen some of that happen in a few countries. Now, it's not only about domestic policy in an electoral sense, because Petro was already very hard pressed into changing his policy with drugs. His so-called total peace plan, changing the approach to guerrillas, to narco-terrorists in the country, which traditionally has a lot of them, the FARC, the ELN, the National Liberation Army, and other socialist guerrillas. I mean, he was already hard-pressed on changing his policy towards that. I mean, record production is a sign that it was not working. So in the electoral sense, it's hard to tell. It might in the short term boost Petro's popularity, but we'll have to wait and see whether that carries all the way until the elections and whether it's enough to change the situation where his popularity is not doing well. And on the other hand, it will probably press him into changing drug-related policy. He was already having to reconsider given what can be described as a failure of his so-called total peace plan, trying to appease narco-terrorist guerrillas involved in drug trafficking.
Okay, Marcos, can I just ask you one more question here? So you said earlier that the relationship between President Trump and Petro is not great to begin with. With this latest event, whether you want to call it an escalation or something else, could this push Colombia closer to China in terms of its relationship and ties?
I mean, to an extent, like I said, we have to keep in mind that the broader trend is that Colombia is a historical ally for the US in the region. So on the short term, we might see some Chinese advancement, but it's very nuanced because China has its own US crisis to deal with the trade war, with rare earth minerals, with Trump meeting Xi at the end of the week in the APEC summit. So there's a lot going on in the relationship between China and the US, and I don't think the Chinese Communist Party would have the energy right now to keep going further in Latin America as it has. In the broader sense, the answer would be not likely, but in the short term, we might see diplomatic relations getting closer, even if as a sign to the US that Colombia might have other partners on the table. So I would say in the short term, maybe in the long run, it would be really hard for Colombia to break away from US influence and from the US as an ally. Let's not forget, though, that we might see some symbolic acts happening. When we had the Chinese spy balloon flying over the US a while back, the same happened in Colombia, and their attitude was way more appeasing than the US was, even back then during the Biden administration.
Well, okay, Marcos, good to talk to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Amazon's cloud service unit, AWS, is struggling to recover after being hit by an outage that took down several popular apps. Cybersecurity expert Ed Amoroso says it could take time before the root cause is identified.
Malicious activity is the minority of event. The reason we spend so much time on the malicious stuff is because that can be really insidious. Like sometimes for me, and I've been doing this for 40 years, when I see something that's having trouble restoring, when I see something that might be getting worse, for example, like it's this and then it's worse, then it's worse, then I start thinking malicious. But when there's an outage, it cascades, and then the company starts to rebuild and you see things being restored and being improved, that's usually indicative of something that does not have a cybersecurity component to it.
The outage rippled through major consumer and enterprise platforms, including airlines, banks, payment apps, social media platforms, and ride-hailing services. AWS is one of the world's most critical cloud infrastructure provider. It hosts everything from streaming platforms and smartphone apps to financial services and emergency systems. Amoroso said, "We are in an era right now where we are very dependent on the cloud providers."
I mean, the ripple effects of this is obvious. We've all become very dependent on cloud, on the big hyperscalers. So the advantage there is that we get great products, services, they're able to amortize a lot of what they do across a wide base. So the costs are low and the service levels are high. That's the good thing. The bad thing is the proverbial all your eggs in one basket. So when you do have, your business running, say, on Microsoft or running on Amazon, you knock wood every day hoping that things are going to be okay. Now,
Amazon said the issue stemmed from a breakdown in how its DynamoDB service was being reached and accessed across the network. Reports of problems with AWS continue after Amazon initially said it fully mitigated the earlier outage. The tech giant says it is fixing the problem and appears to be working. A human rights atrocity described as a modern-day genocide is exposed in an award-winning documentary. The documentary, State Organs, uncovers the Chinese regime's forced organ harvesting trade. A local councillor in the UK told NTD that even though the audience members will be shocked and horrified, more people need to know about it. NTD's Jane Werrell reports from the UK.
A documentary that many say is hard to believe exposes the Chinese Communist Party's state-sanctioned forced organ harvesting.
It's a documentary, so it's real. A film wouldn't be, and you'd know that if you were watching it. But this is real. Despite knowing that people who attend will be shocked and horrified, they need to know.
2 screenings of the 2024 documentary State Organs were held in the Clark Foley Community Hub in Ilkley, Yorkshire. An international tribunal held in London in 2019 found there was clear evidence that forced organ harvesting has taken place in China for years on a significant scale and is still taking place. It found practitioners of the Buddhist school meditation Falun Gong were the primary victim group, with other persecuted minorities, such as Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region, Tibetans, and House Christians also at risk.
It's not an easy subject for anyone to face up to and look, even as someone in the Western world that's quite far removed from it. But it's a modern day genocide. I'm proud that we've been able to show it here today in Ilkley, and I just hope that starts some conversations, because it's not even something that people have any. That's a common thread with people that I've spoken to, just not having any sort of knowledge of it.
It's not what happens in a civilised society, and I think the rest of the world, once as this is well known, will indeed be very shocked. It's just not right. It's inhumane. It's good that people get the opportunity to see what's happening around the globe, and as this is in China.
Some audience members were moved to tears and hoped that more could be done to give a voice to those who can't speak up for themselves. Jane Werrell, NTD News.